Good morning, everyone. And I'd just like to begin off by, thanking Vinny for giving me this opportunity to moderate this particular panel. As a young adult who was formerly incarcerated at some point, this is an issue and topic that I'm particularly fond of and very much am happy to discuss amongst a panel of experts as well as myself here present. And, and a lot of remarks were made by the assistant by the by Carol, and that I completely forgot her title right now. And so I think in in this discussion, we want to set the foundation in terms of why this particular population. And each of our panelists are going to present a different perspective, both from policy, as well as from the research, and as well from personal experience. And so, without further ado, I'll go straight into the questions just because we want to keep it to time. And so I'd like to begin with Jeff, who is the Director of Research and Evaluation Center at John Jay College. And just as a note, everyone, their bios are in your folders, so that's why I'm skipping the bios aspect, just because I want to make sure we can keep the time. But Jeff, based on some of the remarks that were just made, and the particular focus of this particular panel, what would be some of the things that you would say, with some of the research that you've done around positive youth development, how does that particular framework apply to the young adult population?
Completely. So positive youth development or youth development, what the Sierra Health Foundation has an initiative called Positive Youth Justice. These are all, it's a big name that basically implies that we know that young people do not stop developing according to a calendar. That no one goes to bed on a Wednesday night as a juvenile and wakes up on Thursday morning as an adult. So how do we have a legal system that responds to that? In the past, we've had these very simplistic divisions between family court jurisdiction, criminal court jurisdiction, and we've been dealing with this for more than a century, more than 2 centuries. If you go back and read the history of delinquency intervention or youth crime or justice involved young people, however you want to call it, there have always been legal debates and political debates about how to draw the line, and we usually know when we've gone too far when there's some horrible case. And I always refer to this lesson that Justine Pollier wrote about in her book, and I think it was the 16th century in England, where the courts hanged a 7-year-old because they determined that he had somehow killed a playmate and obviously knew right from wrong because he attempted to hide from the authorities. So the whole distinction of knowing right from wrong was the key legal principle in which they decided jurisdiction. Thankfully, that was a long time ago. We don't do that anymore. But is it any less ridiculous to base that decision on the calendar, on how many birthdays a person has had? We make these determinations on these simple, bright line divisions, not because it's a good way to handle young people who are justice involved, but because it's more convenient for us. And I've had this conversation with attorneys, judges, and prosecutors who say, what you portray as a developmental system that responds to an individual young person according to their developmental status sounds wonderful, but I just can't imagine how we would run a system based on that. And to me, that reveals the fact that even though we call it a justice system, we should not accept that an organizational structure is pursuing its mission just because it names itself after that mission. And I think in a lot of ways, the justice system should be renamed the case processing system. Because that's what we really do. So if we didn't do that and really embraced the mission of providing justice to the community and even public safety to the community, I don't think anyone would set up a system where someone transitions from innocence to culpability in one night. So how do we build a system that is not like that in a way that still can function bureaucratically and administratively? And to me, that's the main challenge.
Thank you, Jeff. And just as a sort of a follow-up question, based on some of the research that you've conducted, are you familiar with any sort of evidence-based practices that have worked effectively for young adults?
Any evidence-based practice that works for adolescents would work for young adults because young adults are adolescents. So the only real distinction I think that would be sensible to make, that you make with your own children, is between the ages of 16 and 25, you expect them to gradually take on more responsibility until one day where ideally they could really function independently. And I think that means with a 16-year-old, more of the intervention should focus on family dynamics and repairing relationships with parents and other family members. And by the time you're 23, 24, the focus should be more on labor market opportunities, finishing their education. But other than that transition, I think any program that's been shown to work with a 15, 16, 17-year-old would work as well with maybe some tweaks with a 20, 21, 22-year-old.
And with this particular population, do we have, based on some of these models we have for adolescents, would you say that practicing these different models would essentially lower the rate of recidivism for this particular population?
That's a very loaded question, Hernan. First of all, I was just having a discussion with some colleagues that are here from DCJS about the whole nature of what we mean by evidence-based programs. We should remember, I always say this, but evidence is something that's purchased, it's not discovered. Sometimes people have this notion that there are all these scientists out there looking for effects, and every once in a while they find a good program and they rush to the mountaintop to announce it. It doesn't work that way. The way evidence-based programs are built is you have all these people like me who are grant seekers trying to get funding to do studies, trying to pitch our ideas to funders, and we're all in competition. And when you have positive results from one program, you have a leg up on that next round of competition. So what that does, when we tend to invest in things that we think will succeed as funders, we're basically driving all the money into one segment. So please stop funding research on family therapy, because we know it works. It works. It's a good program. Stop funding research on basic CBT programs, because there's enough evidence to say it's helpful. What we don't do is invest in possibilities. So we do not invest in things like, would it be helpful perhaps for a 21-year-old to finish school and have a way of getting a solid job that can pay their bills? Could that possibly reduce criminal offending? We don't research that. So what evidence-based programs is one sort of can of worms. The other can of worms you mentioned is recidivism. I think we need to start looking at recidivism not as a medical indicator of behavior, but as a relationship between the individual and the state. Because if you live in some neighborhoods around New York City and have certain physical characteristics, you have a very high probability of having contact with law enforcement. So that could lead to recidivism. And of course, your own personal behavior has a role to play in recidivism. But if you live in a different neighborhood, you have a much lower probability of having law enforcement contact and a lower probability of having your behavior observed and reported. So recidivism is not a clinical measure of wellness. It's not a way to base whether a community is safe or not, or improving or not. It's a way of saying the justice system is doing a better job here of detecting problems and intervening than here. So I don't know why we've created this whole policy infrastructure where we think recidivism is a way of judging individuals when it's actually a way of judging the dynamic between individuals and the state.
Right. Thank you. And so on those remarks, right, and in terms of having young adults and recognizing the fact that they do have this difference, and recognizing that recidivism should not be the only measure, we also have brain development research, and we also have to consider the mental health effects of that the system that we currently have. And so Frank Tedeschi from the Value Juvenile Justice Mental Health Service, and he's there as the medical director of psychiatry. I wanted to ask you a question in terms of what are some of the adverse mental health effects that the justice system might bring to young people as opposed to the adult system?
I think the way that I'm going to answer this is beginning by just talking a little bit about brain development research for normal adolescents, and then also speak about what makes the juvenile and young adult offender population unique. So the good news is, yeah, we have tons of research about what makes the adolescent and young adult brain different than older adults. And I'm going to highlight some of those areas right now. So one of the things that was mentioned in the keynote address is this aspect of impulsivity, peer influence, rational decision making. These are difficulties for young adults and adolescents, and it's all based in neurobiology. So in early adolescence, one of the things that happens first is the neurotransmitter dopamine, which is the neurotransmitter that reinforces behaviors and mediates reward. the transmission of that neurotransmitter goes way up. So uh, things that didn't used to be as rewarding, such as peer influence, now take on a whole new relevance in an adolescent's life. It dictates their behaviors, it severely influences their behaviors. The other thing about that, too, is that emotionality is also not yet under control consistently from the other parts of the brain because those parts of the brain have not yet matured. So I'll get to that in a second. But what the dopamine does too is it changes an adolescent's view of rewards and risks. Because there's so much dopamine kind of floating around their brain, what they really become focused on is a reward of a situation rather than the potential negative consequences. And you can see how that could be involved in potential acts of criminality. So two other processes happen that are finished by around age 25. And that's why we keep on hearing that number. Age 25 is kind of, if you want to use a cutoff, and I agree with Jeff, we should not use cutoffs all the time, but from a neurobiological perspective, most of the research indicates that an adult brain is not really adult until around age 25. Some research even indicates that parts of the brain continue maturing until the 40s and 50s, which means that many people in the audience here do not yet have mature brains. So, so there's two processes. There's synaptic pruning, which means that discrete areas of the brain become more efficient in the way they work because unused synapses are gotten rid of, they're cleared out. And then the other process is myelinization, which allows discrete areas of the brain to talk to each other better. It improves communication between the areas of the brain. And so what that means is that the areas of the brain that exert emotional control, response inhibition, are involved in executive planning, strategy, things like that, those mature much later than the emotional reward system, right? And so, for example, myelinization means that the prefrontal cortex can only really inhibit emotional responses to situations by the time you're in your mid-20s. The other thing that's related to each of these neurobiological changes, it's kind of a meta-phenomenon, is the idea of identity consolidation or character consolidation. One of the primary psychological tasks of adolescence and young adulthood is to consolidate your identity, to come up with consistent behavior patterns, to form a view of the world and yourself. And that really doesn't happen until early mid-20s. And so there are ways that we can have young adults who are on a trajectory of what we consider normal identity development and ways that that trajectory can become aberrant. In regards to younger offenders, what we know from the research is that this is a distinct population within a distinct population, meaning that within young adults who are incarcerated and juveniles who are incarcerated, there is a much higher rate of psychiatric disorders than the average population. 60 to 90% have a diagnosable psychiatric disorder. What we also know is there's very high rates of substance abuse. Trauma, in particular, an often under-recognized aspect of these youths' lives, is very, very significant. And so you can see that this is a very vulnerable population, not only from a neurobiological point of view, but also from a mental health point of view. So how does this translate into youth who are placed in adult settings? Well, what we know is that adult correctional facilities can be very stressful environments. There are very high rates of victimization, and what has been demonstrated by the research is that the younger that you are, the more likely you are to be victimized, either physically or sexually. We've also found that the rates of suicide in adult correctional facilities is much higher than in juvenile detention facilities. Some estimates put it at 7 times greater, some estimates put it 36 times greater. That's very significant. Speaking as a clinician, I'm trained as a child psychiatrist, so I have a developmental bias, which I bring to work with me every day in working in juvenile detention. What we know about treatment models in adult correctional facilities is that, though while very well intentioned, they're often adult models that are superimposed on adolescents and young adults that don't take into account these developmental processes that I'm talking about. And so what you see are things like mood disorders and psychotic disorders are very much overdiagnosed. Antipsychotic medications are overprescribed. Things like ADHD, learning disorders, PTSD tend to be underdiagnosed and undertreated. And so you're in a position here where these youths are in situations that are very stressful, very potentially traumatizing, who have mental health needs that may not be completely met. And so the way that I think about this is in terms of the aspect of personality development. I think you can think of it as stunting, but also trajectory can change. If you're traumatizing these youth, if they're not getting adequate mental health care, if they're not being connected with the educational resources that they need, it sets them in a different direction in terms of the path their life takes. And it makes their identity, or it encourages their identity to incorporate undesirable characteristics, aggression as a means of conflict resolution, dominance, things like that. And so these are some of the outcomes that are adverse when you place youth in adult settings.
Now, can I jump in quickly? Just
Yes.
When people cite these prevalence numbers, the prevalence of mental health disorders, substance abuse, trauma in the incarcerated population, I just think it's important to prevent people from concluding that that's why they end up in incarceration. We create that by sorting and sifting and having differential eligibility for diversion. We screen out and divert all the young people that don't have those issues, and so by the time you look at the deep end population, that's where they all are. And I'm afraid sometimes policymakers hear these prevalence numbers and think, so that's the solution to crime then. We need more mental health treatment, more substance abuse treatment. And it's not true at the front end. It's just true of the deep end population.
I agree.
And so based on that remark, Frank, with regards to just mental health providers, would you say that mental health providers could serve as an actual, advocate for this particular population?
Absolutely. I think that, and we can think about that, advocating for them in different ways. Within detention populations, for example, and correctional facility populations, applying developmental models to their treatment is, I think, an absolute must. I think also the idea of, having someone come and you write them a prescription, and that's the end of the interaction is not sufficient. That with this population, again, because of the nature of their neurobiology and their developmental course, and that their identity is not fixed, things like social development, education really have to be emphasized too. These are known ways to prevent recidivism, enhancing education, and pro-social activities. So that needs to be emphasized too. The other way I think that mental health clinicians within correctional facilities can really advocate for their patients and for this population. That's not just patients who have psychiatric diagnoses. It's everyone that can be stressed out in a correctional facility. It's working with the frontline staff and really helping them understand what behaviors are a byproduct of normal development and need to be treated that way. I think also, just as I admit my biases as a behaviorist, having conversations like this where we draw in different aspects of the criminal justice system and different disciplines, I think mental health really has to be a part of that conversation and advocating within not only this kind of group but also to legislatures.
So we have this idea now sort of trending through, and it's the idea that positive youth development model as well as research itself can't conclude in what should be the way to go for this particular population. And there is also the personal narrative and the personal perspective that some people have thought for, myself included, but here we have Glenn, who is the founder and chief risk taker of Just Leadership USA. And I wanted to ask Glenn, if he would be willing to share some of his personal experiences having been a teenager and a young adult in the justice system, and some of your thoughts on some of the comments that were just made, but at the same time, how this impacts our communities at large.
Sure, thank you. First of all, I agree. I think people closest to the problem are closest to the solution, and I'm glad that you and I are on this stage and engaging this audience. And I will talk from a personal perspective because Frank and Jeff said everything I was going to say. Actually, I'm hoping you're not testing me on anything you just said. So, as I was standing for the elevator downstairs, every time I stand still and I lean over and read something, I feel this pain in my back that I've had for many years now. And every time I feel that pain, it reminds me of Rikers Island. And the reason it reminds me of Rikers Island is that the time I spent on Rikers Island, by far, was the scariest time I have ever spent in my life anywhere. And I grew up in Bed-Stuy, when Bed-Stuy was do or die Bed-Stuy, not the Bed-Stuy we all know today. When I got to Rikers Island, the first time I was 15. I was again there when I was 17, and again there when I was 23. And when I walked in when I was 15, I walked into a dorm setting, and it was dark, and it had institutional paint, and it was hot, and it was humid. And at the time, I think we have maybe around 10,000 people today, maybe a little bit under that. There were about 21,000 people there. And that dorm reflected the fact that the island itself was overpopulated. And when I walked into the dorm, I walked to my bunk, and you're out in the open, and there's 60 kids, and they're doing nothing but sitting around, and they're not wearing much by way of clothes because there's no air conditioning, and the only way to stay cool is to dress as sparsely as possible. And I remember saying to myself, how am I going to survive this? And I put everything down on my bunk, and I looked around the dorm for a while, and I just sat there for about 40 minutes, and I just sized up who was who. And the correction officer in that moment was hugely inconsequential, and almost as if he wasn't in the dorm with us. And there was a guy named Tank, a Puerto Rican guy. He seemed 6 feet tall. Maybe he wasn't, but at the time, to me, he definitely seemed 6 feet tall. 6 feet tall is actually still tall for me. But I remember thinking, he's clearly the guy in control. And I walked over to Tank, and I said, I need to use the phone. I need you to make a way for me to use the phone. And he looked back at me, and he said, who the F are you? And I said, I'm the guy that's going to help you make money while you're here doing this bit. And he walked me over to the phone, and he grabbed the phone from the guy who was using it, and he told the person on the phone, he's going to call you back, and he hung up the phone, and he said, use the phone. He leaned over to me, and he said, you effing owe me. And I looked back at him and said, I respect you, but you're going to respect me too. And I used the phone. And then I got to know him, and I got to know the 4 or 5 other guys who were clearly running this dorm. And I became one of the guys who was clearly running the dorm. And we gambled, and we smoked weed, and we played games, and we fought. And then one day, there was a huge fight in the dorm. And when you fight at Rikers Island, you need to figure out who you are immediately and what camp you want to be in. And Tank was Puerto Rican, and I'm black. And immediately, Tank and I were no longer friends, because that is how things run on Rikers Island. And in the middle of that fight, Tank stabbed me 1 time in the neck and 3 times in my back. And that's the pain I feel every time I'm standing up and I'm looking at papers. But I survived, and I made it out. And the next time I went back to Rikers Island, I knew how to bid. I learned how to survive. And I learned that I didn't need to identify who was the strongest, because I learned how to become the strongest. And I started paying correction officers to bring me drugs, to bring me food, to turn their backs, to tell me when the sergeant was coming. I had one correction officer, he just saw me on television the other day, he said he wanted to have coffee. You know what I remember about him? He would take me out of the dorm, take me down to his office, tell me what work needed to be done, ask me to do his work, clean off his desk, and go to sleep. That's my memory of what I experienced on Rikers. That's what I learned when I went to Rikers. The situation I found myself placed into was so much more corrupt than any other situation I experienced growing up in one of the toughest neighborhoods in New York in the middle of the crack epidemic. So I end up upstate. I do 5 years in prison after spending a year on Rikers when I'm 23. When I get out of prison, I work at the Legal Action Center for a few years, and then I end up at the Fortune Society, and I see Stanley in the audience. And I remember getting a call one day from someone who said, my housekeeper's grandson got locked up today, and I need your help. I need to get him out of the system. And I said, well, tell me what he's charged with. He said, well, he's charged with possession of a weapon, kidnapping, endangering the welfare of a child, and attempted assault. I said, I'll get right on it. Except, I know from my personal experience that there's always nuance to stories, right? Like what police officers put on paper is one part of the story. And we know how that works, right? So I wanted to know more about the story. And so I decided to call the child's mom and listen about her version of what happened. So it turns out he was 18 years old. She knew he had a mental health issue, but she didn't have Medicaid, Medicare, health insurance. So he's never been diagnosed, except she knows he's suffering from depression. She lives with him. It's her child. He has a child, and the mother of the child and him are constantly arguing because he's not working. He can't hold down a job. And yes, he had a weapon. And yes, he showed up at her house. And yes, there was a child there. The child was his. And yes, he put her in a room, and he locked himself in the other room. And he threatened himself with the gun. He threatened to commit suicide when the cops got there. And if you look at the police report, it actually had details of the police officers saying that he was in the room with the gun, threatening to kill himself. So I called a prosecutor. I called a friend who's a prosecutor in the Bronx DA's office, and I told her the story. And she's pretty tough as nails herself, actually. And I tried to explain to her that there's details of this case that paint a different picture than what the charges are painting. And I asked her to introduce me to the ADA on the case, and she did. And I begged him to come to Fortune to take a look at what we were doing at Fortune, particularly the Better Living Center, which is the mental health unit that was recently launched at Fortune. And I got the ADA on the case to literally come out to Fortune, to walk around with me, to see the young people in the program, to get a sense of what our diversion program looked like, and to get a sense of how people's lives were being changed once they had access to services. The judge ultimately, and the prosecutor, allowed this young man to come into Fortune for a 6-month rigorous diversion program where immediately he was connected to the Better Living Center. He received medication. The depression issue was hugely stabilized. He went through the employment services program. He never missed a day in 6 months. He never missed a day. He was there every single day. He already pled out, so he knew he was going to get 5 years if he didn't do well in the program. When he finished the program, he had a job waiting for him in Washington, so he was going to fly across the country to live with another part of his family. The judge was so impressed by how well he did that the judge did not give him the probation that he promised him if he was successful. He said, I think that's going to be a setup for failure, and I want you to move on with your life. And when I think of what it took, the lift it took to get that child out of the criminal justice system, right? I mean, I spent a lot of time talking to a lot of people. People at Fortune spent a lot of time explaining to people what we did. And for every one person like that, so many people are more likely to fall through the cracks and to continue down the road where I almost ended up. And the last thing I'll say in this story is about my own experience. So when I ended up in state prison after leaving Rikers, a correction counselor took a look at my grades and said, wow, you should go to college. And then I went to a facility 10 hours away and earned a 2-year liberal arts degree. And I often say that that degree was life-changing. But what was really life-changing was that person who said, you should go to college. And what was life-changing for that young man I mentioned was probably my intervention and spending all that time helping people to understand him as a young person who has huge amounts of potential and opportunity. And so my contribution, hopefully, to this conversation is that we've created a criminal justice system that has so many people involved in it that we want to put them on a track, we want to silo them to keep the system operating. But that's just not how human beings are built, and definitely not how young people are built. They're complex, they have complex needs, and we have to move out of this space of what is most convenient to keep this system operating and move back towards much more individualized assessment and much less of what happens in places like Rikers Island. Thank you.
This is honestly the first time that I've heard your story in that way, and so I thank you for sharing that. And I think tying in all three, I'll just briefly share that my experience was very much different because I'd never entered a correctional facility. I went to a secure juvenile facility for 4 years, and so I got my GED there. I got college while I was there, and I had that one person too who sort of made that one remark that intuitively just turned my whole life around. And so it's just good to see the difference, and that the trajectory might have been very well different for both of us, but ideally there was that one person. And so, like Jeff mentioned, we need to invest in opportunities rather than just focusing on where the data is and what recidivism is saying. But at the same time, from a neurological perspective, thinking about the way the brain develops and how we think about these issues also need to be considered along that path and along that trajectory of the young person. So just as a broad question to the panel, before I try to open up to everyone else in the audience, there might be some people in the room and some people who might be on the live stream who might not be so comfortable with the idea of treating young adults as a unique population. And I know each of you might be able to offer perhaps a comment or a recommendation or a thought per se on that particular thought. And that's why I'd like to begin from Jeff again. And if you have any thoughts or comments that you would make to someone who has that resistance.
Of treating this as a distinct population? It is a distinct population. So whether we acknowledge that or not is really immaterial. I don't care about bureaucracy and labels and processes and eligibility. I care about making sure that every young person in our country has an opportunity to find out what gets them excited, because once someone has a path, they will plug in, and that's what we all want. So why don't we pay attention to their positive opportunities in development and stop pretending that punishment and retribution is public safety. Punishment and retribution is necessary sometimes, but 98% of the time, a young person is just going through the stuff we all went through in adolescence, and they need that person to say, hey, you should go to college, or wow, that's really smart. How did you come up with that? To me, that's good treatment, and good treatment and opportunities that propel that person along that pathway is public safety.
Frank, would you be able to provide some?
Yeah, my perspective on this is, I'm going to make a very clear statement here. I think when we have young adults in custody, we can do things that could make them better potentially, or we can do things or not do things that could potentially make them worse. And I think that the I think how I want to phrase this. Give me a second. I think that in terms of investing in this idea of investing in the future, there's literally cost savings related to having younger offenders tried outside of criminal courts. But I think that, again, this idea of the path is very important, that really kind of focusing in on ways to keep them on the path that we want for them is really very important. And that's education, adequate mental health treatment, access to pro-social activities, and vocational training.
What?
Who are these people? Can you guys stand up who don't believe in kids anymore? Gosh, what do I say about that? I always tell people, we're always looking for a silver bullet, or we're looking for, I read an article the other day, I think the title was, one small idea that can transform the entire criminal justice system. Mm-hmm. Yay. I can't wait to read that article. Hugely complex issue. I can't imagine this one small idea. But what I often tell people is just remind yourself what worked for you and what works for your children and what works in your community, and close your eyes and think of what safety looks and feels like and smells like. And rarely will you talk about police cruisers and shotguns and cells and those sort of things. You talk about healthcare and opportunity and family and church and all the things that we know keep communities safe. And particularly when it comes to young people, because it's such an opportune time while people are trying to figure out their identity in this world. What I didn't mention is while I was in college, so when you grow up in Bed-Stuy, you have a narrative that allows you to survive, and sometimes that narrative also allows you to engage in the sort of behavior I was engaging in. And the narrative has a lot to do with this country and how we've treated people of color in this country, and that translates into what I deserve and what other people don't deserve. And I did a good job of othering everyone. And then I'm sitting in this class, and I'm watching a film about the Holocaust. And in the middle of this film, a big piece of Caterpillar bulldozer equipment pulls up to dead, naked human bodies stacked about 6 high and bulldozes them into a hole in the ground. And I just remember that being a moment that just created a chink in that narrative about people of color and what they've been through in this country, and just reminded me that in the end we're all human beings, and yes, we have that history in this country, and it's important to hold on to, and to pull down flags when we can. But at the same time, we have much more in common than our differences. And if we think like that as we think about this population, we don't have to go searching in the halls of academia to figure out the answer. We can sit at our dinner table and figure out the answer to these problems. And so I would urge us to do a lot more of that, especially coming out of this tough on crime era where we all needed the politically correct thing to do, right? The safest thing to do. This is an issue that starts with risk. And if you don't have an appetite for it, you should get out of this game. Because if you get stuck on the idea that it's all risk, you'll never do anything new, different, and anything that has ingenuity. But if you realize that in the end, we should be doing what works, and yes, some people are going to fall through the cracks. That is the nature of this business that you're in. Then I think we have a chance of moving away from where we are and creating a criminal justice system where we recognize that the deprivation of liberty is punishment enough, and that at that moment we should be thinking about what else we can be doing to build people.
Thank you so much. So we had some very good statements to that question, and so now I'd like to open it up for perhaps maybe 1 or 2 questions from the audience, and it can be directed towards the panel or it can be directed to one specific person. So do we have any questions in the audience? Dr. Brian Shanahan.
I love a softball. So, sure. So the question was, I wonder how you see how Just Leadership USA, your new initiative, can help create leadership amongst folks who are directly impacted to be a part of the solution, as I mentioned in the beginning. Well, first of all, what we do clearly, for me, stands on the shoulder of people who've been doing this work a lot longer than I have. I remember sitting in a prison cell and hearing about people like Eddie Ellis and Divine Pryor and other folks who've been doing this work a lot longer than I have, and therefore took a lot more risk than I'm even taking doing this work. But what I realized a long time ago is that often when I sat in rooms like this, when I'd get in the hallway, people would say, wow, your contribution was amazing. And initially I thought it was just sort of patronizing. I was like, this guy went to Harvard, and he went to Yale, and he went to John Jay, and Jeremy's still around? No. Oh, damn, I put that plug for Jeremy.
I'll tell him.
And what I realize is that experiential knowledge is equally important in this space, and it becomes a bit of a lens to be able to process recommendations through. That's valuable for people who just haven't had the personal experience. And so what I also recognized when I ended up being in a pretty senior position at the Fortune Society is that I was suddenly being hugely exceptionalized. And that was becoming very problematic to me because I'm not exceptional. I've been exposed to exceptional opportunities. And so the question is, how can we do that for other people so that they can stand up and show leadership? And so if people haven't checked out Just Leadership USA, please take a look at our website and know that what we're doing is 2 things. One, investing in the leadership of people all across the country who've been involved in the juvenile and criminal justice system. It's a year-long, very intensive leadership training, and the core of what we're doing is to help people take responsibility for the outcomes that they're producing. So building leaders that can lead no matter what space they're in. And I think as you folks clearly show, you find the voices and the leadership of folks hugely valuable. But we're also a membership organization, and we have 11,000 members in 42 different states around the country. And who are our members? Anyone who believes that our current criminal and juvenile justice systems are a huge threat to our democracy. So I would urge people to take a look at the website and become part of the work we're doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Glenn. Did anyone else have a thought? Well, on that note, just to keep exactly on time at 10:15, I'd like you all to over here to thank everyone in the panel for their participation.